Buenas tardes, buenas noches, buenos días. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Chancleta Generation Podcast. All right, everyone. I'm sure you know by now that I'm Clemencia. I'm the founder of Moira Studio, and I am your host. I work at an advertising agency that communicates with Latinos the only way that it should be done, which is authentically. And today we're going to talk about a very interesting topic, at least to me, and to a lot of my friends who have children. I don't have children, but I do care about my friends' children and about other people's children too. So I wanted to talk about this. So according to statistics, the majority of Latinos that live in the US have been born here. The majority are now second, third generation, fourth generation, whatever generation Latinos. What that means is that there's a staggering amount of Latino children in the school system and in universities. I know when I went to high school here in the US 30 years ago, there were only a handful of us in my high school, and so race was a huge issue. But even if there are more of us in the school system now, it continues to be an issue. And I believe that it is up to the schools to make those spaces safe, and then to make the kids feel welcome and valued. And especially in such a divided country, politics should not come into the school system. And so what should we do? What can the schools do? And what can we do as parents or people that care about children do to make it safer and better for our Latino kids? So with us, to dispel all of this, of course, you know me, I always bring the experts. I'm not gonna just talk at the wall here, thinking that I know anything at all, because I don't know anything at all. I bring the experts. So today we have with us Laura Chávez-Moreno. Welcome.
Hello, thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you for coming. I'm so super excited to hear your insights on this. So a little bit about Laura. She is an award-winning researcher, qualitative social scientist, and assistant professor in the departments of Chicana and Chicano and Central American Studies and Education at the University of California in Los Angeles. Her research has been published in top-tier journals, and she has been recognized with multiple awards, including from the American Educational Research Association and the National Academy of Education Spencer Foundation. I told you I bring the experts here. Most recently, the National Council for Teachers of English awarded the 2023 Alan C. Purves Award to her article, The Continuum of Racial Literacies, Teacher Practices Countering White-Stream Bilingual Education. This award is given annually to the author of the most impactful article published in the journal Research in the Teaching of English. Dr. Chávez-Moreno has taught in all levels of schooling, including elementary, secondary, tertiary, and older adult education. She was a high school teacher of Spanish in the School District of Philadelphia for 5 years, wrote district curriculum, and served on boards of community organizations. She grew up in Douglas, Arizona, and Agua Prieta, Sonora, Mexico. Professor Chávez-Moreno's book, How Schools Make Race, Teaching Latinx Racialization in America with Harvard Education Press, will be released October 1st, 2024. What an impressive bio here.
Muchas gracias, Clemencia. Thank you so much.
So I love to hear, what is your high-level idea on, the issues of race in schools, and then we can start diving into some more details.
Sure. I think one of the big takeaways, or like you mentioned, the high-level idea would be a recognition that schools, what I call make race. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by make race is schools impact our ideas about what is race, and what are the racialized groups in our society. And we live in a racialized society, and schools are a very important part of that society. They are an important part, an institution that a lot of people engage in, public schools. So schools are actually an institution that recreates and maintains these racial ideas in our society. So one of the things that I say in the book is that we have to recognize this, that schools are an important institution in our society in terms of the way we understand race. And because that's the case, then schools should play an active part in how they should think intentionally about how they're teaching about these topics.
Yeah, I mean, at least for me and for other people that have told me, it was in school that some kids have seen people of other races for the very first time. Right? This is the first time that they've seen like a woman in a burqa or like any kind of religious, another religion that they're not used to, or like, you know, a person from another race. And so parents may not know how to handle this. And they may also have their own, you know, biases. And so, you know, I don't agree that it should be on schools to do everything, of course, but this being this one place where all kids of all races and backgrounds and religions come together, I do think that something needs to be done to make it a little bit smoother for kids to be able to go to school without being discriminated or made fun of or bullied because of what they look like.
Sure, and that's actually one of the important parts about the book, is it talks about some of the lessons that were imparted in this bilingual education program that I studied. So I studied a secondary level, which means a middle school and a high school. And what I found in the program was that a lot of the lessons concerning race were things that students had been learning since elementary school. So for example, be nice to others, don't discriminate or don't be mean to others based on how they look, etc., which are obviously very important lessons for students to have. The issue that I find and that I describe in the book is that these lessons were taught in elementary, which is great. The issue is that they're also then taught in middle school and then in high school. And by the time that students are in high school, they really need more lessons in terms of advancing their racial understanding about society, because students were very interested in learning about or wanting to understand how our racial society works, or racialized society. But some of the lessons that they found their program or their teachers provided were lessons that they just felt were not really helping them enhance their understanding.
So they were just oversimplified concepts of like, be nice to everybody. But then what if people from my background are at war with other people from other background? Like, how should I treat that? That is a more advanced complex to me that maybe is beyond just be nice to everybody. How do I treat, you know, things like racial tensions or just world tensions in a smaller context, right?
Yeah, and that's actually one of the interesting things I think about the book, is that it explores what are races and how that's different for example, ethnicities in our culture. So an ethnicity is a group like that has cultural practices that are similar. They recognize each other. Through these cultural practices, they interpret the cultural practices in a similar way. And a racial group, a racialized group, is actually something that's constructed through racism. So when a society historically, institutionally, legally, like all of these different ways, discursively in terms of like how people talk about it and our policies in our institutions, for example, even immigration, etc. All of these institutions come together to then kind of distribute resources differently based on different groups. This is what creates race. So that's why we have these different racial groups, because historically in the US, the US has distributed resources differently based on racial group. And that's the same case now in the US in terms of which schools are resourced, which schools are not, and then even within a school, which students in terms of the group, right? Which racial group has access to the different resources that schools provide.
Yeah, because right now, even still, many schools are not legally segregated, but they sort of are, because of, property taxes and the way that the school system works. There's schools that are like abnormally high amounts of Latinos, or abnormally high amounts of only white students. And so these kids are still in silos many, many times. And then they go into university, and that's when they're just like, what's going on? I mean, I've heard people in Texas tell me, I didn't see a white person until I was in high school. And it's like, when you live in silos. And the thing is, many parents, because they're so scared of what would happen to their children if they're in a very diverse environment, they keep sending their children into this very segregated schools. Like this, but the school system is not making it more welcoming, or even universities. They're like, well, our student body is our student body, and it's like, well, you need to bring in some more diversity into your student body. But it's not just a matter, and I get this all the time in conversations, in just advertising itself. We can advertise and be effective in our campaigns, but then what happens once the people buy the product or join the thing or come to the school or whatever? Are you making this a welcoming and safe space for people? And are the rest of the students prepared to have this influx of a different, more diverse student body? And that is those are super big concepts that I just don't understand how the school system has not nailed this down yet.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting because one of the things that I'm most concerned with is the distribution of resources, because students are capable of a lot of wonderful things. They're capable of expansive learning, etc. The issue in the U.S. has been this distribution of resources that is unequal and inequitable, and both unequal and inequitable. And in terms of what I argue in the book is one of the deficits of schooling right now is the way that it talks about and the way that it's teaching about race. Because for people who live in a racialized society, there should be some type of understanding about what it means to be in this racialized society. And if we're not providing this type of opportunity for students to learn about these type of critical understandings of race and how racialized groups are formed in our society, I think that that's actually something that schools are neglecting to provide students that they should provide.
So what kind of resources do you think that should be more evenly distributed, and how can we start doing that?
Thank you. One of the things is definitely bilingual education. So in the U.S., the Latinx communities have been historically provided an education meant to assimilate them. So providing them, for example, schooling that is subtractive in terms of the language and culture, wanting them to only learn English and forget their languages. And I say that in plural because it's not just Spanish. So forget their languages. So schools need to provide opportunities for students to develop their home languages, to learn English, and then to also learn about different cultures, not just their own obviously, but different cultures, and then to also learn about how to critically understand their society and why is there that we are a racialized society in the first place, and then how to combat that also. One of the things, if I can answer your question in terms of very specific, it would be, for example, providing teachers with a curriculum that helps them develop those type of ideas throughout a program. For example, when I studied a bilingual program, so that teachers have access to the types of lessons that would help them enhance their students' understanding about race and racism. That would be wonderful for teachers to have, because one of the things I found in the study was that teachers who were interested, who were invested in having students deal and grapple with these kind of ideas, they had to spend a lot of their own time finding materials, thinking about how to do this. And they also felt very alone in doing it. They thought sometimes that they were the only ones in the program that were doing that, when there were other teachers who were also invested in this. So I think that in terms of how to provide, what type of services to provide, there does have to be more intentionality in schools in order for them to support teachers in doing this work. And one of the things that what's going on in the U.S. right now is the unfortunate debate about whether or not, or actually this debate about schools not teaching CRT. And I say that in scare quotes because it's not CRT that they're teaching, right?
It's the truth.
It's this wrong debate about like, oh, schools should not be teaching about race at all. That's really not the debate that is that we should be having. We actually should be focused on how to improve the teaching of race in schools, not trying to ban different books, etc.
Yeah, and I also think that, in history, and I remember from my history classes, it was not really emphasized the awful consequences of racism, the wars that have happened, the suffering across the world because of it. It was not said, like, it was kind of implied, but it was not said, hey, you know what? These are the horrible consequences of racism, and we should not do that because, we can be better. We can learn from our history. And that is something that maybe just people are maybe afraid to say. Maybe parents may be up in arms about it or whatever. But it is fact. We need to learn from our history. We need to learn from our past. And racism has brought terrible, terrible things to this world.
Yes, thank you. And one of the things that I argue in the book is that in order for us to improve our society, schools also have to play a part, right? Because they're a very important institution in our society. So schools and for example, bilingual programs that are meant to, for example, uplift or to provide a better education to Latinx students, those programs, and then other schooling obviously also, have to be intentional in how they're teaching about the concept of race, and then how they're also teaching about what is Latinx in relation to race. So for example, students had questions about whether Latinx was an ethnic group or a racial group, and there was like some confusion or negotiation, I guess, in terms of like people were trying to like understand different ideas. And it would have been a really great way for teachers to approach advanced ideas about race in exploring, well, is it an ethnic group? Is it a racial group? Like what are these concepts, for example?
Yeah.
And what makes a race? Yeah.
And those are touchy subjects sometimes. I mean, I remember we work with the census, and the census did not have that question. People had to fill it in on their own. Is it an ethnicity? Is it ancestry? Is it a race? And so I think those are touchy subjects, and I definitely agree that teachers need guidance, like big guidance from main organizations saying like, this is the language that we should use. And there has to be tons of research on this, on like what kind of language to use to improve the education of the kids, for them to use more inclusive language and things like that. But it just keeps feeling like we're hitting these walls, and to me it almost feels like, I don't want to say that this is being done on purpose, but it sort of feels like that, right? I don't know.
Well, what's definitely done on purpose is the resource distribution historically. I mean, there are lots of schools that know how to provide excellent education, and they're well resourced. So in the US, we don't have a problem in terms of like what it is that we don't know what to do. We do know what to do. We need to fund education, public education, much better than we are, and support teachers in a much better way than we're doing now, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. But I also, maybe your research has not extended universities, but I feel like universities are pretty well funded and they still are lacking those kinds of resources. Not the resource like money, but or at least like bringing in the resources to maybe even remedy some of the lack of resources of the lower education that the kids came from. I don't know.
Yeah, you're right that I'm not a higher education scholar and definitely not sure about funding. But for example, public education throughout all levels has been underfunded, including in states that have historically funded higher education more, because there has been an attack about what the public views in terms of the service of what higher education is providing us as a public. Because there's been this attack about our institutions, our education institutions, because there's been this attack, which has been an intentional attack, it has prompted folks to not want to fund higher education or other education institutions. So there's definitely this type of like intentional aspect of it. And the interesting thing about, for example, teaching about race in schools is that oftentimes students that are fortunate enough to go to a higher education institution and take ethnic studies courses or other courses that expose them to ideas about race, to critical ideas, I should say. They often say, like, why wasn't I taught this before? Why wasn't I taught this in high school? And this is a common thing that I hear. I'm a teacher, a professor of an ethnic studies program in Chicano and Central American Studies here at UCLA. And I hear this from my students, like, why wasn't I taught this in high school? And it's unfortunate because higher education is doing the service that high schools should also be doing. High schools should also be teaching about these ideas, obviously in a way that's appropriate for that grade, for that level. But it shouldn't be the case that students are exposed to these ideas in higher education, especially because the way that our society is structured, not all students go to a higher education institution.
Yeah. But so, we know that sort of the resource has been done on purpose. We know that maybe the school system is scared of like an uprising of the parents or whatever. I mean, we don't live in a religious, well, it is a religious country, but we are supposed to separate the state from religion. But it still feels like it's very tied. And also, there is obviously a tone of, I'm going to say it, there's a tone of white supremacy running through underneath. And I'd love to kind of talk about, if we had these resources, if kids were able to learn more about race, how would this country look like?
Oh, wow. I don't know, but I think it would be much better. One of the things that I say in the book is that you're not just learning about it just to learn about it. You're learning about it because the way that you think about how society works helps you also think about what are the solutions to our problems in our society. So you're learning about these ideas about race in order to also be able to expand your imagination about what are the possibilities for how we organize our society. What are the possibilities for how we distribute resources? Yeah. What has our past told us about how we've distributed resources? So then what do we need to do to correct those injustices? So that is really what this education that I know a lot of other scholars say should be a priority. The reason we think it should be a priority is because having that type of knowledge will allow us to imagine this future.
Yeah. And I mean, like, personally speaking, I know that people that have been marginalized or have suffered injustices in turn go and try to make it so there are less injustices with the people they know or with their children, or at least they're more sensitive to it. And so I think that, even if you belong in a race that has not been marginalized, learning about that makes you think that I want to make it better for other people too. It's not just me. And the only way that we're all going to get through this into the future, the only way we're going to solve big picture problems, climate change, economic change, resources running out like water or things like that, the only way we're going to get through this is together, is thinking about these big world problems together, not like, oh, well, the water is only going to be here and then you guys are screwed over there. It's like, no, it doesn't work that way. Like everybody is going to have to work on this together. And the best minds are everywhere. It's not just one race that's smarter than the other. Everybody's smart in their own different ways and can bring lots of different color to and solutions to lots of different issues. And so to me, the takeaway for these kids is like, hey, we have super smart friends from all over the place, and I think they deserve a chance too.
Yes, thank you. One of the things that I listened to in another podcast that you did was about your experience. I think it was in high school that you took an economics course, and you were saying in your podcast, like, I wonder why that wasn't provided to other students. It was just like kind of like an honors or college track, and that's actually a really great example about how schools distribute resources differently. In the bilingual program that I observed, they did the same type of thing, where even within the program, they tracked some students based on, for example, their math scores. So if they had like really great math scores, they were tracked into like more like a college level or like a college track. Or for example, they were also tracked on their English acquisition. So because the program was a racially diverse program, the classroom itself in this bilingual program was half Spanish speakers, which in this context meant basically they were all Latinx. And then the second half of the classroom was students who were learning Spanish. So they were dominant in English. And because this was in the Midwest, that meant that the English dominant half of the class was almost all white students. Maybe there was a couple of Latinx students who were English dominant. And then maybe there was like one or two students who identified as Black. So it was a racially diverse program in the sense of like, this distribution that I described. And one of the things that I found was that the students who were distributed or like given better access to better education was students who were English dominant. So for example, at the end of the school day, all the students would have in the middle school, they would have what was called the biliteracy course. And they were tracked into, for example, if they had passed different English scores, they were tracked into the higher biliteracy course. And then what they did was they, for example, were able to read a book with a friend of theirs. And and research shows that this is wonderful for students to do, to be able to choose a book and to read it with others. This is excellent way of educating students.
Yeah.
And then the students who were tracked in the lower level, for example, students who were learning English, so that means the Latinx students, they were tracked into the lower biliteracy course. And what did they do there in that half hour? They did a computer program that was a multiple choice, like they would just read a little paragraph and then they would alone, all by themselves in their little laptop, they would click, A, B, C, or D based on like what they read. Or like another day, for example, they did like a review of phonics. These are things that are not really enhanced learning opportunities for students. So even within the program, there was this type of tracking in terms of like which resources are distributed to which group. And one of the things I argue in this book is that even within the bilingual education program, this type of tracking, this type of thinking about who deserves what based on like what language they speak, etc. This still happens even in this bilingual education program.
That's very interesting, and that's pretty sad as well, because I was thinking about the amount of second generation Latinos here there's a good amount of them that are going to be the first ones to graduate from college in their whole family. And so something like math is, unless like you have a parent that is like really on top of it and like maybe studying with the kid, helping them with their homework, putting a lot of importance on, math or just homework or just education in general, may not have that knowledge. And so if they're already tracked into a lower level education, that's already, setting them up for life for that kind of living. And so it's like, does it really, like, I think it does matter to actually put a lot more effort into the kids, even if they're not proficient from the get-go, because you don't know what's going on at their home, but you want all of them to succeed. Doesn't matter what happens at their home. Some of the kids may be kids of single parents, or there's so many things that could happen, especially in our community. There's a lot of people struggling to raise their kids, and their kids should not suffer because of it, especially in one of the richest countries in the world with supposedly a very strong school system but it still happens.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. And you're right that this happens. And like, for example, in the book, I showed different ways that happened in this program. One of the things I emphasize in the book, and I'd like to share here, is that this is not because some teachers are mean and they don't want the Latinx students to have like enhanced learning opportunities, like, for example, reading a book with their students. What happens is that there's external pressures from, for example, school districts have this pressure to increase Latinx students' English proficiency, because we have this idea that they don't know English, etc. So they need to be better. They need to be more proficient. And how do we measure that? We measure that by these tests that they take. And then what happens is that instead of them having better instruction, because they need to pass these tests that are, for example, coming down from the state level,
they make the tests easier.
Yeah. So it's not about like individuals being like mean towards students. It's really a structural thing, and schools are kind of caught in this bind that people need to make sure to unite as a community and to say, our students need to learn English in better ways. And for example, having a multiple choice question that they have to do like at the end of the school day, that's really not enhanced learning opportunities. The issue is that a lot of these things are structural. The district is following orders for like how to do this based on for like what the state requires from them. So it is a structural problem.
Well, if we invested more of our tax money into education than into military, then I think things could be a little bit better for everyone.
A lot better.
Because this is not just happening to, kids of color. There's also white kids that are being left behind because of the same reason. So it really does affect everyone. And then you see it, you see it in politics, or you see it, now we have this election and there's so much misinformation going on because people do not have education levels that gets them an understanding of how politics work, how the economy works, how intergenerational racial interactions work. And so then there's fear, there's misinformation. This is all just seeping into the fabric of the country now that people that did not have good education are now grown-ups, and they're living in this world, and they're making a lot of decisions in that. And you could really see when people have not had an education, or when they have not interacted with other races, when they've been living in these silos, and you could see it. It's not just like, oh, it's a kid issue. It's like these kids grow up at some point, and now they become adults, and it's so much harder to educate an adult than educate kids when they're actually forming their thoughts and their view of the world.
Yeah, one of the things that is interesting about the study that I did is that a lot of the research is in the elementary level of bilingual education, and for the type of program that I did, I looked at the secondary level. So I looked at what's called a dual language or two-way immersion program, and I looked at the middle and the high school in order to see what type of lessons were being taught there, and then how the program was serving Latinx students. So it's interesting to think about like this generational aspect about what are the racial ideas that people are exposed to based on their episode, or not episode, but where they are, where they are in their life,
their stage. Yeah. I mean, because even Latinos, you know, sometimes when they have this assimilation mindset, and I've seen this firsthand, and I've seen this firsthand with myself, you start thinking that your culture is not as important as other cultures, or you start trying to like be more white because that gets you to more things, more power, because your culture is disempowered. That is one of the most sad things that I have seen, and I've seen it, you know, from kids not speaking Spanish because, you know, it's a language of the poor people or the language of the immigrants or whatever, all the way to, you know, Latinos discriminating other Latinos because they're immigrants or because of this and this and the other. These are all constructs of like not having an understanding of racial interactions or how race works, and it shakes me to my core to think that somebody would reject their own culture because they're trying to be something that they're not. And so it works both ways. It's not just like then we have this reverse racism in which like I'm literally looking at people and going, but have you seen that? Like, have you looked at your face? Like, you are a Latino person. What are you thinking? But it's just the way that it's a survival. It's survival method, and people end up doing a lot more damage to themselves, trying to be somebody that they're not, rejecting who they are, and then rejecting the people around them.
Yeah, racism is a really nefarious process that happens in our society, right? And it affects everyone differently. But really in negative ways. One of the things that you mentioned earlier was that it also affects white folks, and that's a very interesting way to think about. Also, I really would recommend reading the book to your listeners, The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. It's a wonderful book that shows about how racism affects obviously people of color or racialized people, and it also affects white folks. So it's interesting to think about that it does affect everyone. It doesn't just affect negatively people of color, but it obviously is very disproportionate in its effects, and it's very disproportionate in terms of also the elite of white elites, for example, who are shielded from racism's effects because of their wealth, for example. So it's something to think about. In the book that I wrote, it's interesting because the way that racism worked there, because the students were also of different classes in terms of their racial group. So most of the Latinx students who were in the classrooms that I were observing were very few of them were of middle class. Most of them were like in working or lower class. And then the white students in the program were mostly middle class. So there was also this class dynamic in terms of like who had access to this program based on their class aspect. But in the end, the program advantaged folks who were in the middle class kind of throughout, including, for example, Black students, who in this program were seen as what some people call the model minority. So in the program, the Black students who were who were from families from immigrants from Africa were mostly seen as the model minority in this program, not the Latinx students.
Interesting. So we're getting close to our wrapping up time, but if you, after doing all your research and seeing all the also structural education issues, like what would be like your top 3 things that you would recommend that the school system does, or the parents, whichever you think is the most effective?
Okay, top 3. Okay, that's hard because we have a lot of recommendations, professors. But okay, top 3 I will try to limit. One thing is definitely, like I've been saying over and over again, the distribution of resources is what makes our society a racialized society in terms of like how it's distributed to which groups. So we have to think very clearly about how we're distributing and make sure that it's equitable throughout society. So that's one thing, distribute resources equitably. Something else that would be like a top recommendation would be to support teachers. And when I say support teachers, I mean through, for example, teacher preparation, being supportive of teachers before they're teaching, and then teacher professional development during their teaching. So it's really throughout the teaching span. It's not just when they're in the classroom. Right. So that's what I mean by supporting teachers in order to engage in this work. And then a third recommendation would be for communities to make sure to support teachers. So this is for teachers who are engaged in this work now, especially because it's such a contentious time politically, and teachers are being attacked. Depending on where you live, teachers may be fired because of their teaching about race. So communities really need to support teachers in engaging in this type of work. So those would be my top 3 recommendations.
The third one is really interesting because the people who oppose CRT are really loud, but I'm sure the majority of the parents are okay with it. So they also need to be really loud and say, it's okay. I am okay with my kids being taught, or not banning books, or like things like that. It's up to the parents to keep schools accountable on the quality of education of their kids, and the teachers are just doing what the curriculum tells them to do. So I know that those are the ones that they have the most contact with, but the school is it should be accountable for it. So it's important for parents to be really on top of this, and because it's gonna pay off at the end. It's gonna pay off when your kid grows up and they're living in a new world that is going to be very different from yours because you did something to make it better. So this was great. Thank you so much. Please tell us your book, How School Make Race. Yeah. It's coming out October. Well, already came out. And
October 5th it came out.
Where can we buy your book?
Thank you. So How Schools Make Race, Teaching Latinx Racialization in America, came out October 1st. It is published by Harvard Education Press. You can go to their website. You could also buy it through Amazon, through Goodreads, or through Barnes & Noble. So pick it up. Let me know what you think. And you could also visit my website. It's laurachavez-moreno.com. And you can sign up for my listserv to see different speaking events that I'll go to. I just had one in Madison, Wisconsin, and then I'll have one at UCLA here on November 19th. So hope to see you there.
Well, good luck with your book. This is absolutely interesting to me, and as you can tell, I'm very passionate about it. So thank you so much for giving us so much insight into your research and into your ideas. And we need more people like you to bring these things to light in a less emotional, just more factual, objective way, in which we're just saying this is how things are, and with removing any kind of emotion from it, and just saying like, scientifically, this is what I think. So thank you so much. And for you guys out there, get the book. And also, if you have any more questions for me, You know where to find me, Clem at chancletageneration.com, in the TikToks, Chancleta Generation, and in the IG, Chancleta Generation, and then X, Chancleta Gen. Please share this with all of your friends that have children, because you know what? Sometimes you think that is your kid, and then you realize that it's a systemic thing. And then you take away that guilt, that shame from it. And then you understand that you are good parents, but the system is going against us, and we need to fight that, not fight each other. All right. Besitos, everyone. Thank you.
Gracias.